Okay, so using code of practice to inform accept or decline decisions. There you go, I read it out correctly this time. So an interpreter's code of practice, or also known as code of conduct, provides the foundation for a professional interpreter, and it's based on a number of ethical principles. So the ethical principles that it's based on are: do no harm, strive to do good, act justly and fairly, be honest, keep your word, and respect others. So these, broadly speaking, are the ethical principles that a code of practice or a code of conduct is founded on. Now, normally, there are quite a few different codes of practices out there for interpreters. There isn't one specific overriding code of conduct. Often the language service providers will have their own code of conduct. If you want a really definitive code of conduct and one that's that pretty much covers everything that I think it should do and is respected in the community, the Nrpsi, National Register of Public Service Interpreters Code of Conduct, which is free on their website, is a really good one to check in with. Nrpsi is really for level 6 interpreters, but the standards in the Code of Conduct really apply to everyone. And it's even if you're not level 6 yet, why not aspire to be acting in the same way that a level 6 interpreter would do, certainly in terms of code of conduct and code of practice. In fact, most of the code of practices that I have seen for interpreters are pretty much the same anyway. They all pretty much talk about the same kind of things, and they're all based on the same ethical principles. And clients themselves might have code of conduct as well, so that, the NHS might have a code of conduct for interpreters that they want people to work with. But generally, they are very, very similar to each other. So as long as you have a reasonable understanding of what's in one code of conduct, you can pretty much guarantee you know what's in the rest as well. So I have the different aspects now in a code of conduct. Okay, let's move on then to accuracy. So essentially, in terms of accuracy, it is all about being correct, being as precise as possible. So if you remember about what the interpreter's role is, first and foremost, sort of the core role that you're providing as an interpreter is to preserve the meaning of the message, and that's without missing anything out, without adding or without altering anything, while also reflecting the register and the tone of each speaker. So like I said before, interpreting goes way beyond just providing a literal interpretation of the words. It's also about making sure that the meaning of the message is imparted as well. We will talk again in Unit 5, I think, about register and tone, and we'll go into a lot more depth about that. But it's also about reflecting that, because you'll probably know better than anyone, being that you're all language experts, that words don't necessarily make up the whole of the communication. It goes a lot deeper than that. So it's part of the interpreter role to be able to interpret the meaning as well as just the words. So accountability, it's all about taking responsibility, like you say. It's about being aware of liability and risk. And it goes beyond that as well. And we will talk about this next point in Unit 5 as well, admitting to any mistakes and rectifying them. So as the role of the interpreter, we've already spoken about accuracy, which I'll add there as well now, about preserving the meaning of the message. But sometimes as an interpreter, you might have slightly misunderstood what's being said in the first place. And it might be that later on in the conversation, you find out a new bit of information, or you're given a bit of information or a bit more context that allows you to realize that actually the way you interpreted something before was incorrect. Now that in itself isn't doing something wrong. People make these mistakes, and it can be difficult sometimes when you're not familiar with a case, or when you're not an expert like a doctor, to misunderstand something. But the important thing is, if you do realize you've made a mistake, it's being able to rectify or correct them. And again, we will talk about the process for doing that later on, because it does happen. So as long as you rectify a mistake, even if you made one, provided you're not making them all the time, obviously. But if you do realize that you've made a mistake, then you can go back and correct it. Okay, so the next one is confidentiality. Yeah, I mean, the interpreter, like a doctor or one of these professionals, social worker or a job centre representative, I don't know what they call them, job officers maybe, is in a privileged position, really, that you're getting to hear some very, very confidential information. And of course, like all these other professions, there is a need for you not to share that information without the party's consent. So generally, impartiality, you're absolutely right. You wouldn't give advice or express a personal opinion. You'd have to be impartial.
Don't take sides.
Say that again, sorry?
Don't take sides.
Yeah, exactly. Don't take sides. Treat everyone equally, regardless of anything really. It's like equality, really, in some ways. So you treat everyone in a subjective rather than objective and professional way. And then any conflict of interest would be, for example, if you knew the person or beforehand, or you're related to the person, or there was any way that you could gain from interpreting in that session by changing the information. Not saying that you would do, but if there was. And what you would actually do if there was a conflict of interest, then you would be, under the code of conduct, you'd need to disclose that to the professional. So, for example, some communities are quite small, and if you're doing a face-to-face interpreting assignment, let's say it's in a GP surgery, in an area where nearby there's a community of people from the same background, then there is a chance that you'll know the person, or you'll know a friend of a friend, or you'll know someone that knows that person. Sometimes it's unavoidable because some communities are really small, so there's almost no way of getting an interpreter into a session that doesn't know of a person in some way. So in that case, again, it's down to yourself to disclose it to the professional and then allow them to deal with it. Sometimes they will just say, that's absolutely fine. I understand that. I'm going to rely on you to be professional, but we're going to carry on anyway. Other times, depending on what it is, they might say, thank you very much for disclosing it. In that case, what I need to do is find a different interpreter. But as long as you have reported it, then you're clear, essentially. You've done what you need to do. It's then on the professional to make that decision. If you didn't disclose it and then something happened afterwards, then someone could say that you're liable for that. So it's always better to disclose it. It's essentially, put very simply, declining assignments that go beyond your competence. So whether it's the subject matter, the skills being asked of you, or anything else, then you just wouldn't want to accept an assignment that's beyond your competence. Professional development, really, it talks about your own responsibility within your own power. Obviously,
well, yes, if you are capable of assuming responsibilities and to acknowledge your own mistakes, I think this is very important.
Yeah. So in any profession, then there's always a requirement to develop yourself professionally, because unless you are absolutely the best that there is and the best that can ever be, which sadly some of us will never get to those standards, then I think you can always maintain your standards, you can always improve your standards, you can always look to expand your skills and knowledge, you can always find out what your weaker areas are and work on improving those. And it's certainly in interpreting, because again, the subject matter that you deal with and will be interpreting for changes so much, then even as a very minimum, just try and keep up with changes in terminology, regularly update your glossaries, just so that you've got the tools that you require and that you need to be able to deliver the professional standard time and time again. But yeah, you're right. If people, there's also other people's opinion, and they might think you have a weakness, but there's nothing you can do about that as long as you yourself are working your hardest to be the best that you can be, I think. So yeah, respect for all parties. So it's showing respect to all the people involved in an interpreting assignment, and regardless of background, ethnicity, sex, beliefs, etc., etc. So essentially just treating people as you would expect to be treated. Excellent. So that's the code of conduct. And generally, you can use that code of conduct not just to inform yourself about whether or not you should accept an assignment or decline an assignment, but it's also something that will help you and act as your backup. If you act and do everything within the boundaries of the code of conduct, then if you do get a complaint from a client or a language service provider, you'll always know that you'll be able to defend that and say, well, what I did was in line with what was in the code of conduct. So that's why I behaved in that way. That's why I took the actions I did. And you can't really go far wrong.